There we go.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. I'm Jim Mackin. I'm one of about a dozen of our members, and we're fortunate enough to have one of our members this evening presenting on her book. And this evening's program will be called Down by Riverside, the Park, the Drive in Bloomingdale. But first, let me tell you briefly about what we are. If you Google Bloomingdale history, or if you go to our website, upperwestsidehistory.org, you'll see a treasure trove of local history, a whole bunch of articles about our local history on the Upper West Side. You'll see a building database that catalogs every building in the 90s and 100s. You'll see blogs, you'll see wonderful pictures, photos. You'll see a list of our upcoming neighborhood tours and walks. And you'll see a way to get on our list because we send out a quarterly newsletter, which has also wonderful historical bits and whatnot. And we've got quite a number of people this evening, close to 200 people. So we're going to give a quick shout out to our old friend, Justin Ferrate out in New Mexico. Justin's an old friend of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. We have a lot of his friends looking in this evening. So let me tell you about tonight's program, which is built around Stephanie Azzarone's book, Heaven on the Hudson, Mansions, Monuments, and Marvels on Riverside Park. But she's aptly named this evening's presentation, Down by Riverside, the Park, the Drive in Bloomingdale. And let me emphasize, this is now the book about Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. It makes a great gift for the holidays. If any of your friends or relatives live in the area or they visit you from time to time, this is the book to get them. It has spectacular photographs, stories, notable people, so many things of interest, and it's a virtual tour guide of Riverside Drive. It'll take you pretty much block by block up Riverside Drive. Stephanie Azzarone, she's a native New Yorker. She's lived most of her adult life on Riverside Drive. She's a former journalist who freelanced for a number of publications, including the New York Times, New York Magazine, and she ran an award-winning public relations agency for a number of years. And now we're so fortunate to have her as a valued member of our own Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. So with no further ado, Stephanie, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Jim, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. I am so delighted to be presenting today to the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group audience, because the group is, as Jim said, so dedicated to local history, and it's just wonderful. I love it. Before we begin, I would like to say a very big public thank you to the members of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group Planning Committee for sharing their expertise and their advice as I was writing Heaven on the Hudson, and for their ongoing support since the book has been published. They've been absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. That said, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Down by Riverside, the Park, the Drive in Bloomingdale. My plan this evening is to share the story of the early years of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, incorporating Bloomingdale. My goal is to tell the tale not by reciting a litany of events in chronological order, but rather by looking at the development of the park through the eyes and the thoughts and the deeds, and for tonight's presentation, the glorious mansions of the people behind it. The men who conceived the idea of Riverside Park, who promoted it until it became a reality, who designed it and later redesigned it to make it the Riverside Park that we know and love today. Importantly, many of those people actually lived in the neighborhood, either before and or after the park was created. They were the pioneers. So for them, this was not just some giant municipal project or an exciting investment opportunity. This was their home. Let's begin at the beginning. The original Riverside Park extended from 72nd Street to 129th Street along the Great Hudson River on New York's Upper West Side. Picture, if you would, what that area must have been like 500 plus years ago in the time of the Native American Lenape, and then in the early 1600s, the era of the first Dutch settlers. A high rocky cliff was bordered along the river by deep green forest, undisturbed save for hunting and gathering. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, that scenery had begun to change, largely due to huge land grants by the English, some 150 acres or more per person. Now, to put that into perspective, a football field is roughly equivalent to 1 acre, meaning these early settlers owned about 150 football fields worth of real estate along Riverside Park. Today, where a few farms arose at that time on this land, followed by a smattering of grand estates or country seats inhabited by families whose names you will know from history, but also from contemporary street and building names, among them Delancey, Apthorpe, and Livingston. That oh so handsome gentleman on the left is Henry Brockhouse Livingston, about whom you will hear more later. His family back in the 1700s was sworn enemies with that of the gentleman on the right, Oliver Delancey. They both lived not very far from the Apthorpes. From around the mid-18th century to the mid-19th, what we know as the Upper West Side, especially close to the Hudson River, became that century's version of the Hamptons, a beautiful waterside escape for the wealthy, filled with lavish homes. As one promotional brochure for the development of Riverside put it, ever so dreamily, in the olden time, when this region between the Central Park and Riverside Park was occupied with the villas of the wealthy and luxurious New York merchants, it surpassed anything in the land for the elegance of its buildings and the beauty of its landscape gardening. The photo here is of the William Ponsonby Furnace home between what would become 99th and 100th Streets on Riverside Drive. So, Bloomingdale. It was either built in the 1830s, 1840s, or acquired at that time from an Apthorpe descendant whose home was built in 1800 and later much expanded. Furnace was an American who made his fortune in the shipping business. He lived most of the year downtown, but each spring traveled with his wife and 6 children to his uptown estate. When Furnace died in 1871, his Riverside Drive estate was valued at about $1 million, or $23 million in today's currency. After their parents passed away, the Furnace siblings rented out their childhood home, advertising it as, in 1871, a country house and grounds, Riverview, stable, gardener's lodge with 5 rooms, garden and fruit trees, house containing 16 rooms, bathroom, oven, and kitchen range with hot and cold water, stationary tubs, oilcloth, etc. Also to let, 6 acres or less adjoining. With this, however, came the proviso to never open the small locked room on the upper floor. Some years later, the home was rented to Alma Walker, who ran it as something of an artist colony, whose guests included, among others, Gertrude Stein. It was said of the mansion's early days, the lawn sloped to the water's edge. Here were heard the merry shouts of romping children who loved the house as their birthplace and played in the lush grass and blossoming groves with the freedom of country life, or bathed or floated, feeling a sense of proprietorship of the river that then was only dotted with occasional sails and formed a gentle boundary to their parental domain. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Today, what was once the furnace mansion, is the Wendelin, 276 Riverside Drive on the corner of 100th Street. This replaced the furnace home in 1911. Andrew Carrigan built just a bit north of Bloomingdale on the northeast corner of 114th Street around 1836. Carrigan, an Irishman, was first a merchant and later president of the Emigrant Savings Bank, and upon his retirement, dedicated his time to the welfare of others, including protecting immigrants from the many robberies they suffered at the time. The house was an imposing white edifice with balustrades curving around its roof and stately columns encircling its facade up through the second-story balcony. The home reminds me of the White House South Portico. Unlike the White House, however, this home was surrounded by a friendly white picket fence. Years later, in 1874, the home was sold to Janet Lockwood Rudd and came to be known as the Carrigan Rudd House. Photos from the time show the opulence of the mansion, with its intricately carved plasterwork ceilings and woodwork, plush chairs and sofas, thick carpets, dark wallpaper, and richly gilded picture frames. That's Janet Rudd in the upper left. Her daughter, Althea Rudd Ward, is seated fourth from right in the lower right-hand corner at her 5th birthday party. A major shout out here to the Rudds for sharing their family photographs with us. In January 1911, headlines announced that this home, termed one of Riverside Drive's oldest landmarks, had been sold to builders planning a, quote, high-class apartment house. By the following year, the 12-story Hamilton, 420 Riverside Drive, stood in its place, complete with white glove doormen and buzzers on the dining room floor with which ever so discreetly to summon staff. Interestingly, the Rudd family, it turns out, never entirely abandoned their old home. With its columns and curved front roof, the family mausoleum in the city's Greenwood Cemetery bears a striking resemblance to the family home. The lovely, peaceful, and bucolic nature of homes along the river remained until 1846, when the Hudson River Railroad, later merged with the New York Central Railroad, slashed through those dense virgin woods that had been home to hunters to lay tracks along the waterfront, allowing freight trains to run between New York City and Albany. Nothing much new really happened in the neighborhood for another 20 years or so. But when it did, the changes were dramatic. I'd like to share the stories of those who had the most impact on the area's development, the men I like to call the leading social influencers of their time. Some of their names you will know. Others, although they were incredibly impactful back then, have been lost to time. For purposes of this Zoom call, let's bring them back. Toward that end, I'd like to tell first the tales of the most notable men who made the park and drive. Cyrus Clark, Egbert Ludovicus, and this last name I've heard pronounced 3 different ways, Vili, VLA, and VL. Tonight I'm going with VL. William R. Martin, Andrew Haswell Green, Frederick Law Olmsted, and Calvert Vaux. And then I'd like to tell the stories of some of the pioneers and one power broker who came after. Among them, George Noakes, Bloomingdale residents Peter Dolger and Samuel Bain, and last but certainly not least, the man everyone loves to hate, Robert Moses. Cyrus Clark. Cyrus Clark was once well known as the father of the West Side. He was so called for his role as a premier champion of the area, as well as one of its major investors. Keep in mind here that the men who fought most forcibly for the development of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive happened to be those who would make the most money if in fact they succeeded. Nothing really new there. Clark lobbied for neighborhood improvements such as mass transit, street lamps, and sewer and water lines, and specifically for the development of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. He was for many years president of the West End Association, previously called the West Side Association. It was formed by leading businessmen to promote public improvements north of 59th Street and west of Central Park, thereby bettering both quality of life and the value of their property investments. You'll hear the West End Association referred to frequently this evening. Also note that what we now call the West Side was early on more often referred to as the West End. Now, Clark had built a significant personal fortune in the wholesale silk business, and clearly a man with foresight, later studied real estate development. In 1866, long before Riverside Park was built, he purchased the house and extensive property of Henry Brockhost Livingston, the distinctive-looking gentleman pictured earlier. The house, known as Oak Villa, was built before 1811 near what is now 90th Street and Riverside Drive. In 1888, Clark commissioned a new house, also on 90th Street, but directly across the street from the old one. The new one is seen here. It was faced with rough-cut granite and had a marvelous red tile roof, distinguished by a delightful array of chimneys, dormers, and two wonderful spiky towers. And it was surrounded by porches that were the ideal setting for the area's stunning views of the river and beyond. At the time, it cost the outlandish sum of $90,000. What did the Clarks see from those ivy-covered porches? Steamships and sailboats, ferries and small fishing boats too, and tugboats. Despite that glorious view, however, once two of their children married, the Clarks decided to downsize from their villa and move to a new row house on West 76th Street. After Clark's death, a sculptural bronze relief memorial was created in his honor and embedded in a rock outcropping near the 83rd Street entrance to Riverside Park, where, if you look carefully, it may still be seen today. We have something slightly out of order here. Let me continue. Okay, Egbert Ludovicus Viel. Aside from possessing a delicious middle name, Viel, like his neighbor Cyrus Clark, played an important role in the development of the Upper West Side. Also like Clark, Viel was a key member of the West End Association advocacy group. He actively promoted mass transit for the area and was an outspoken proponent of Riverside Park. What we would call today a true multi-hyphenate, Viel was a West Point graduate, an Army Brigadier General, a surveyor, U.S. representative from New York, one of the first sanitary engineers in the country, and engineer-in-chief of Central Park. Interestingly, he also submitted a design for Central Park, but lost that competition to Frederick Law Olmsted, about whom you will hear more in just a few moments. Viel was responsible for the Viel map, published in the 1860s and celebrated as a great cartographic masterpiece. The map shows New York City's waterways, canals, swamps, rivers, ponds, and more, superimposed over the street grid. It has been referenced during the construction of some of the city's most famous buildings, including the Empire State Building and the World Trade Center. Viel maintained that as the city paved over bodies of water and leveled out natural drainage channels on the march uptown, underground waterways would stagnate, leading to yellow fever, malaria, and even plague, among other diseases. As a result, he campaigned vigorously for an effective sewer and sanitation system, becoming a key lobbyist for the Metropolitan Health Law of 1866. Now, notably, this was the first New York state legislation for the comprehensive control of sanitary conditions in the cities. Most importantly for our story, the bill's requirements when it came to clearing out of the disease-breeding waters of the Upper West Side contributed greatly to the region's development. Throughout the 1870s, sewers and water mains were built in the area. Also like Clark, Viel was an enthusiastic believer in the area's worth and future. He wrote, "This entire region combines in its general aspect all that is magnificent in the leading capitals of Europe. In our Riverside Avenue, the equivalent of the Chiaia of Naples and the Corso of Rome." I love the drama. There was a lot of this, a great deal of hyperbole and over-the-top enthusiasm, both by individuals and in the media, when it came to the likely future of the area. Now, Viel anticipated that the Upper West Side would become home to what he termed a higher order of domestic architecture than it has been the good fortune of New York heretofore to possess, and maintained that it would evolve into one of Manhattan's most desirable residential districts. In 1872, Viel built a red brick, ivy-colored villa for his family on what would later become Riverside Drive on the southeast corner of 88th Street. Perfectly rounded windows embellished the tallest of the home's many towers. The mansion faced south with a broad veranda extending around the south, west, and east sides. Look closely at this picture, and you will see the man himself standing on the steps of his estate, which was replaced in 1911 by 155 Riverside Drive. While extremely confident about the area's future, Viel was less so about his own. He harbored a fear of being buried alive, which apparently, according to one source, was an unfortunate but surprisingly common problem in the 19th century. And upon his death in 1902, he had a buzzer installed in his pyramid-shaped mausoleum at West Point, which, if pressed by him, would alert someone in the cemetery office. I am happy to share with you that there is no record of it having been put into service. William R. Martin. Martin was a man with a mission and great skill in marketing that mission. At the time, Martin, a lawyer and real estate speculator, was a parks commissioner, as well as president of, you guessed it, the West End Association. In 1865, 15 years before Riverside Drive and Riverside Park became a reality, he published a pamphlet called The Growth of New York that proposed changing 12th Avenue into a combined scenic carriage drive and park along the Hudson River. Riverside Avenue, as Riverside Drive was initially known, was conceived as an elegant and expansive boulevard lined with trees, overlooking the park and the waterfront and bordered by imposing mansions. Martin envisioned this future development as forming the city's preeminent residential street, expected to eclipse Fifth Avenue with ease. Now, this vision of Riverside Drive as the new Fifth Avenue is the key theme throughout the early development of Park and Drive. In his pamphlet, Martin imagined a time when West Side residents, quote, could come out of a summer afternoon upon the Riverside Park and, through its drives and walks, among its flowers, under the cool shades of its old trees, in its casinos, or small buildings in this case, and refreshment houses, could have in the city all the enjoyment of the millionaire in his $100,000 villa at Irvington, a village on the Hudson River in Westchester County, New York. Now, I ask you, what investor or homeowner in his right mind could resist a description like that? Other enterprising gentlemen of the era quickly shared their own romantic visions for the city. Quoting again here, the 8th Avenue, it was predicted, on the west flank of the park, in other words, Central Park West, would become a street of millionaires' mansions, outdoing even 5th Avenue in spectacle and grandeur. West End Avenue, it was asserted, would one day become a magnificent shopping street. Well, that never happened. And an even grander future was predicted for Riverside Drive. Martin's own future, however, turned out to not be quite as bright as he had hoped. In 1877, Martin was hit with 3 foreclosure suits, and a year later declared bankruptcy. A few years after that, his housekeeper, a Miss McDonald, sued him for a grand total of $833.70 in back pay, for which the court found him liable. Andrew Haswell Green. The next step toward fulfilling this ecstatic real estate reverie that everyone was having occurred a year after Martin's pamphlet was published. So in 1866, Andrew Haswell Green introduced an act to the New York State Legislature for the development of a park and drive along the Hudson River. A lawyer, civic leader, and the giant of 19th century city planning, Green is considered the father of Greater New York, a name given to him by President Theodore Roosevelt for Green's leadership role in consolidating the city's boroughs, making New York at the time the world's 2nd largest city after London. Cyrus Clark, remember, was simply the father of the Upper West Side. Green got the entire city. Green also served as president of the Board of Education and as a city controller. For many years, he was active in or led the Central Park Commission. Green was a key driver behind major New York City sites, including Central Park, the New York Public Library, the New York Zoological Society and Botanical Gardens, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The act Green presented to the legislature became law in 1867, empowering the Central Park Commission to acquire land above 72nd Street between the Heights and the railroad tracks for Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. This was, so to speak, the green light. The land was purchased in several stages, with the first portion secured through eminent domain in 1872. Also in 1867, when the law was passed, the Park Board was permitted to establish streets and bulkhead lines, condemn waterfront piers and wharves, and otherwise help prevent commerce from encroaching on the park. In 1873, authorization was granted to reestablish the grade of what would become Riverside Avenue, later Riverside Drive. Now, here comes the juicy part. It was not until many years after all of this, in 1903, that Cornelius M. Williams either mistook Green for a man who was having an affair with Williams' lover, or, depending on the newspaper account you credit, believed that Green had protected a woman who had spread fake news about Williams. In any case, Williams shot Green 5 times right in front of Green's home in the middle of the afternoon, killing him. That is Green's funeral that you see in the lower left-hand corner. In honor of Green's contribution to the city, the flags of City Hall were lowered to half-mast. In his Encyclopedia of New York City, architectural historian Kenneth T. Jackson called Green arguably the most important leader in Gotham's long history, more important than Peter Stuyvesant, Alexander Hamilton, Frederick Law Olmsted, Robert Moses, and Fiorello LaGuardia, which I think you'll agree is saying something. With the land now ready for park and residential development, it was crucial to find a fitting design for what was to be an entirely new community, one meant to attract the city's foremost families. Again, everyone is thinking Fifth Avenue, West Side version. The park commissioners turned to none other than Frederick Law Olmsted to design Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, the upper and lower levels of this extensive and exciting new undertaking. To answer a question that I had before beginning Heaven on the Hudson, and which you may have as well, yes, the park and drive were both part of the same project, undertaken and opened, although not completed, at the same time. We've talked about the men who most influenced the development of the park and drive. Now, let's look at the man who designed them, or at least the original version of them. I'm sure everyone on this call knows the name of Frederick Law Olmsted and that he designed Central Park. But did you know that he also designed Riverside Park and Riverside Drive? And beyond that, Morningside Park, just east of Riverside Park, and Prospect Park and Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, among many, many others. Olmsted was the principal landscape architect of his time and the leading pioneer of that profession. As a boy, he experienced the delights of nature during trips through New England with his family. Later, he was influenced by the writings of English landscape experts and visits to England's parks and countryside. For many years, Olmsted pursued a most varied career. As a journalist and author, he traveled throughout the American South and Texas for the New York Daily Times, now known as the New York Times. In his dispatches to the publication and in subsequent books, Olmsted maintained that slavery was not only immoral, but also expensive and economically inefficient. Beyond that, Olmsted served as executive secretary of the United States Sanitary Commission, a precursor to the Red Cross. He took part in the organization of the Southern Famine Relief Commission after the Civil War, and later helped create the New York State Charities Aid Association, where he served as vice president for many years. Olmsted was also active in the founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the American Museum of Natural History. In 1857, he was named Central Park Superintendent. And as if all of that weren't enough, in 1872, he was nominated for Vice President of the United States by a splinter group of liberal Republicans. Although flattered, Olmsted withdrew his name from consideration. Olmsted had a background in both engineering and farming, as well as a belief that exposure to nature by all classes was important to the health of society. At a time when so-called parks were most likely to be within private estates, or like Gramercy Park, locked behind gates to which only the wealthy had keys, this was a novel concept. Along with being a man of extraordinary achievements, Olmsted was also said to be of a very kind disposition. According to his obituary, it is related of him that he once remodeled his plans for extensive private grounds when it was found that they would interfere with a mother watching her children at play, and changed them entirely so that the mother might not lose the pleasant vista. Apocryphal as that may or may not be, it's a wonderful story. He also married his brother's widow and adopted their 3 children. In 1895, when Olmsted was 73 years old, the famous artist John Singer Sargent painted this portrait of Olmsted leaning on his cane against a bucolic scene of flowers and trees. We have more than 100 pictures in the book, and this is one of my absolute favorites. I had to share it with you this evening. Olmsted was commissioned for the Riverside project in 1873 and submitted a preliminary plan that year and a final plan 2 years later, designed to develop Riverside Park and Riverside Drive together. And here is that plan, which, as you can see, has Olmsted's signature and the date in the lower right-hand corner. I just love that. Olmsted's proposal for Park and Drive featured a design to fit the area's hilly, rocky topography. A different, less inspired plan presented before his involvement pictured a straight line, 100 feet straight drive, 100 feet wide, that followed the city's street grid rather than the shifting contours of the cliffs. Carrying out this first approach would have required extensive leveling and regrading and the construction of a retaining wall far too high to allow practical access to the park. Discontent with what was called an unimaginative and impractical first scheme led to Olmsted's hiring. I suspect that the fact that Olmsted's design would also cost less than the original plan, because it required a lower retaining wall, likely did not escape the city's notice. In Olmsted's vision, the park's eastern border would follow the area's undulating pattern of nature. He wrote that the location presented great advantages as a park because the riverbank had been for a century occupied as the lawns and ornamental gardens in front of the country seats along its banks. Its foliage was fine and its views magnificent. He incorporated those gardens and that foliage into his design. According to the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, Olmsted combined the land purchased for the avenue and that purchased for the park. He considered the existing grades and contours, the existing plantings and views, and designed a winding drive that would be comfortable for horses and pleasure driving, provide shaded walks for pedestrians, and yet would give easy access to the real estate bordering it on the east. Olmsted considered this location ideal for hosting the city's main promenade for drivers, riders, and walkers alike, and designed it to be long and wide enough to accommodate different types of traffic and activities. Plans for Riverside Drive, which would parallel the park and river, included a tree-lined pedestrian walkway, a lane for horseback riding, you can see the bridle path here, and 2 broad lanes for carriages, with a median separating northbound traffic from south. Olmsted's proposal stated part of the main highway, specifically that portion between 104th and 123rd Streets, which of course included parts of Bloomingdale, was to be arranged as a public promenade to command views over the Hudson and to be shaded in all its parts. North of 123rd Street, in the area of the Claremont, the Grand Ole Estate and inn and restaurant that lasted from around 1800 to 1951, the park and the drive were to be arranged to allow a resting and turning place for carriages, from which the view of the river was to be kept as open as possible. Finally, by early 1877, work began on Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. At the time, the largest and most ambitious single municipal road building project ever undertaken in New York. Now is the time to note one very important fact. Olmsted's Riverside Park ended at the railroad tracks. It was park, train tracks, Hudson River, nothing in between. As was typical for the era, the vacant land to the west of the tracks would be developed with commercial docks to serve the shipping companies that plied the trade along the waterfront. Also keep in mind that the commercial use of land bordering the river would be a major point of contention for years to come. Also notable is that although he was responsible for the sweep and swerve of Riverside Drive, Olmsted's work did not, in the end, extend to the park's interior. In 1878, 2 years before Riverside Park's official opening, Olmsted was removed as park superintendent because of Tammany Hall politics. Put another way, Boss Tweed fired the god of landscape architecture. Some years later, William R. Martin, remember it was Martin who enthusiastically promoted the whole Riverside Park, Riverside Drive idea. Martin wrote to Olmsted asking if he, Olmsted, would consider further consultation on Riverside Park. Olmsted would not, writing, "I don't want to bother with New York politics and will not move a finger to secure any engagement with the department," meaning the park department, "nor have anyone else do so on my behalf." That's telling him. In any case, over the next few decades post-Olmsted, there was no comprehensive plan for the design of the park's interior, nor was Olmsted's original concept for it fully followed. Instead, the interior was developed by a series of designers employed by the Parks Department, including Calvert Vaux, Olmsted's old business partner. Vaux was appointed superintending architect of the Department of Public Parks in 1881 and was likely responsible for laying out the park's first set of paths. But apparently, no one really knows what Vaux's role was in Riverside Park. Olmsted, it would seem, had a much better publicist. All that said, Riverside Park and Riverside Drive opened in 1880. They were a huge success, incredibly popular right away, especially among equestrians and later bicyclists. Photos show the drive bustling with open carriages and strollers in 19th century finery. Studebaker, a carriage manufacturer before it began producing automobiles, ran advertisements featuring a well-heeled lady enjoying a carriage ride down the avenue. The day's equestrians frequently rode to the north end of Central Park, then up 7th Avenue, now Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, north of Central Park, and back down alongside Riverside Park. Throughout the mid to late 1890s, when cycling in the city drew thousands of riders and spectators alike, the drive was New York's most popular setting. Harper's Weekly called it the paradise of bicyclists. The New York Times declared, "The Sunday procession of cyclists has got to be one of the sights of the city." On any given day, carriage drivers, behatted equestrians, and carefully balanced cyclists would compete for space and the opportunity both to enjoy the view and be part of it. Park and Drive eventually attracted homeowners who created amazing residences. I have introduced you to some of the important families who lived in the area before the Park and Drive came to be. Now let's look at some of the pioneers in this newly created neighborhood. George Noakes was a native New Yorker and a wealthy restaurateur who lived between 113th and 114th Streets. Completed in 1884, his handsome home was built of textured granite and trimmed with stone. It was situated on a terraced lawn atop flights of steps and featured an abundance of decorative details, including an open terrace, a recessed portico, a loggia, prominent bay windows, a sharply angled roof, and a turret that, from my point of view, was fit for a fairy tale princess. Inside were 10 bedrooms, an 18-foot-high conservatory with white marble floors, a tiled vestibule, halls with mahogany trim, ceilings with mahogany beams, and stained glass windows, as well as a dressing room, billiard room, and 2 wainscoted bathrooms. Though it looked sufficiently hunkered down to last forever, the Noakes house met its demise just 22 years later in 1906 to be replaced in 1910 by the Riverside Mansions apartment building at 410 Riverside Drive. And there you have it. In 1885, 1 year after Noakes built his home, Peter Dolger purchased a large lot on the northeast corner of 100th Street in Bloomingdale, part of the original Furnace estate, which we talked about earlier. An immigrant from Bavaria, he established a brewery that became one of the largest in the country. He promoted his brew as a nerve, body, and strength builder, and moreover, quoting here, as healthful liquid food. The company remained in business until 1947 and is perhaps best known today for its array of promotional giveaways, such as branded beer trays it offered right before Prohibition. A devout Catholic and the father of 10 children, Dolger had his architect build a chapel to adjoin his home. Completed in 1889, the mansion was red brick, trimmed with brownstone, with multiple balconies and 2-story bay windows. Stone columns supported the portico, and pedimented dormers of various sizes erupted on the rooftop. It was written that Peter Dolger's large red brick house is one of the landmarks from the river. A small herd of white deer is usually to be seen in a netted enclosure. A score of white pigeons flutter around the stables, and quacking ducks and cackling hens do their utmost to persuade Mr. Dolger, to say nothing of his neighbors, that he is in the midst of a country farm. The Dolger family lived on Riverside Drive until Mrs. Dolger's death in 1925, when the house was sold for $900,000. A year later, the 15-story, 280 Riverside Drive apartment building stood in its place. One last example of post-Park Bloomingdale pioneers. Samuel Bain and his family also took up residence in the hundreds, where, according to one source, no part of the drive affords a more picturesque view of the Hudson and Palisades than does the crescent-shaped section lying between 100th and 109th Streets, and which holds many of the best residences on the drive today. Bain came to the US from Ireland at the age of 25, began his career manufacturing linens, and moved on to the oil business and then to banking, eventually heading the Seaboard Bank. In fact, The neighborhood proved to be quite the draw for Century's End for bankers. The drive from 104th to 108th Street in particular became known as the Bankers Colony. Bain was the first banker to buy and build there. He was also president of the Riverside Drive Property Association and somehow managed to find the time to write at least a half dozen books on subjects ranging from astronomy to travel. Over time, he built 2 grand residences in the neighborhood. The first, of yellow brick trimmed in red sandstone, was built in 1887 on the northeast corner of 108th Street. In 1889, Bain began buying up all the lots he could get his hands on between 107th and 108th Streets, from Riverside Drive to West End Avenue. He sold his first home in 1890, and in 1891 built a larger, more dazzling place on the southeast corner of 108th Street, directly across from his earlier residence. This one joined brick with stone and featured a towering 4-story corner pavilion, along with a tantalizing array of dormers, bays, and balconies, and rows of windows tightly grouped together. At the entrance, a massive arch offered an outsized welcome to visitors. When Bain resold the remaining lots in 1899, he restricted future construction on them to no more than 2 detached homes and required that there be at least 30 feet between the houses in the middle of the block and those on either corner, thus assuring appropriately upper-crust residences. As a result, in a city where most buildings today are packed tightly together, there are airy openings between 355 and 353 Riverside Drive and between 352 and 351 Riverside Drive. Bain remained in his second home until 1921, when he sold it to make way for 355 Riverside Drive, a 14-story dark brick apartment house designed by his son-in-law on the southeast corner of 108th Street. Bain's plan was to occupy the full-floor penthouse apartment. And I have to quickly share the story of a later residence of a Bain home. In 1896, Henry S. F. Davis bought the Bain's original home on the northeast corner. After Bain's death, his widow, Cora, and her new husband, John A. Rutherford, were living there when the Bona Vista apartment building arose next door at 362 Riverside Drive, between 108 and 109. Well, Mrs. Rutherford did not stop by with a welcome basket. Instead, she erected a 36-foot high, 75-foot long brick spike wall, blocking many of the residents' views not only of her garden, but also of the river to the south. In 1915, her home would become the 13-story apartment building at 360 Riverside Drive, named the Rutherford. It appears her neighbors made no comment. All of the glorious homes I've described here along Riverside Park were built in the 18th or 19th centuries. But starting in the early decades of the 20th century, the park began to slip into a major state of decline. What happened? The railroad's ever-increasing dominance of the park and general neglect of what made this space special. From the early days of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, the railroad had affronted the senses of those who lived on the avenue and those who, as a result, determined never to do so. Today, a passing train's low whistle from within the tunnel, followed by a deep guttural chug, is to me a soothing sound. But back then, the endless clattering of wheels over open-air tracks grated on the nerves. All the while, passing steam engines spewed smoke upward to the drive and its residents, accompanied by the scent of the livestock being transported to downtown butcheries and of the garbage dumps lining the tracks. As you might imagine, summer, when windows were thrown open for cool breezes from the river, presented a particular challenge to residents' olfactory glands. Also, during the Depression of the 1930s, the dispossessed had set up living quarters along the tracks and river. As of April 1934, there were 52 structures known as Veterans Shacks within the 7 blocks between 72nd and 79th Streets, and 83 other shacks along Riverside Drive on the Hudson River. At the same time, the railroad continued to block access to the waterfront, except for commercial purposes, separating the community from the river with barbed wire fences. So despite its vital role in commerce, the railroad increasingly came to be viewed as a nuisance rather than an essential and inevitable part of the park. There were multiple efforts from the 1870s on by community organizations and the city alike to force the railroad to clean up its act. Finally, to the delight of many, in 1913, the New York State Legislature pressured the railroad into developing a plan to enclose the tracks in a tunnel that could support a park or an esplanade from 72nd Street to West 123rd Street. Finally, exciting. Yet, it was more than a decade later before change began to happen. In 1924, the passage of the Kaufman Act mandated that all trains in New York City run on electric power rather than steam. Electric powered trains were simply not possible at grade level, primarily for safety reasons. Around that time, meanwhile, the automobile began to dominate as a form of transportation. 1/3 of New York City residents had cars. Traffic choked the city streets, and there was interest among officials in creating a highway along the western end of Manhattan to decrease congestion and provide a rapid route to and from the city, as well as an opportunity for scenic pleasure driving. Also in 1924, Charles Craig, the city's comptroller, proposed a plan for a parkway near the Hudson to alleviate traffic on local streets. The idea was to use landfill to extend the park past the railroad tracks and include an esplanade along the waterfront, as well as a roadway, in this case on top of an enclosed railway. The project also would involve landscaping the new land, restoring the existing park, and providing playgrounds and athletic facilities. Craig's plan was the first of 4 recommendations for Riverside Park's reconstruction proposed in the 1920s alone, not a single one of which was implemented that decade. One problem was that while there was overall support for a parkway, there was little consensus on where exactly it should go. Some, like Craig, suggested building the parkway above the proposed railroad tunnel, which would have brought the sounds of passing cars much closer to the residents of Riverside Drive. Others preferred converting the top of the tunnel into parkland and building a waterfront parkway instead. Various civic organizations weighed in over time. Finally, by 1927, the city and New York Central agreed to share the cost of covering the tracks and building what would become the original elevated West Side Highway to 72nd Street. In June 1929, wonderful news, the city approved a plan that would build the parkway above the tracks, not on the waterfront. All was at last good to go. And just 4 months later, in October of that year, boom, the stock market crashed and plans for railroad tunnel and highway alike were stopped in their tracks. While all of this was happening, or rather not happening, Riverside Park itself was suffering from neglect. Water had destroyed some of the existing landfill, forming massive puddles in various spots where it had seeped through. Mud was everywhere, sucking at the heels of those in search of a stroll. Between the railroads and the rain, Riverside Park was a mess. Whoops. And then came Robert Moses. Brilliant, impatient, ruthless, arrogant, powerful, and politically savvy, a believer that his way was the only way, Moses was a man who knew what changes he wanted to make in New York City and made sure that nothing and no one, from mayors to money, stood in his way. Moses lived on the Upper West Side much of his life. As a young man, he often visited Riverside Drive, looking out over the park from the high bluffs. In his book, The Power Broker, author Robert Caro writes that what Moses saw in Riverside Park was a wasteland, nothing but a vast, low-lying mass of dirt and mud. Moses early on conceived what he wanted to do, conceived a marvelous view of Riverside Park. And by the early 1930s, he had the position and the power to realize his vision. And it took just 3 years to do so in full. In 1934, 2 decades after sharing his concept for Riverside Park in the story that Caro tells, with Moses on a ferry across the Hudson River, which I won't tell now because we're running out of time, all of this became a reality. And Moses, then park commissioner, introduced his West Side Improvement Plan. This enormous undertaking involved covering over the New York Central Railroad tracks and transforming Riverside Park. And that was not all. It also included completing the West Side Elevated Highway, begun in 1927, but then abandoned, constructing the New York Henry Hudson Parkway, and then connecting the highway to the parkway at 72nd Street. Accumulating the required city, state, and federal funds in the midst of the Depression required exceptional skill, along with often enough a strenuous bending and even breaking of the rules. Needless to say, Moses got the money. The focal point of the Moses expansion was the multi-purpose rotunda at 79th Street, which you see here, which not only featured a traffic circle providing an easy entrance to and exit from the Henry Hudson Parkway, but most importantly, thanks to the sunken circular plaza that led to the water, it gave New Yorkers long-awaited access to the river, beyond the few existing narrow footbridges that led to yacht clubs along the shore. They could finally get to the water's edge without risking life and limb. The structure's lower levels in Moses's time hosted a fountain and a restaurant with an arcaded terrace overlooking the marina that was designed to be the city's front door for visiting yachts and marine dignitaries. As for the railroad, Moses encased it in a tunnel under the park from 72nd to 123rd Streets, eliminating street-level railroad crossings. The top of the tunnel was then allocated to parkland. Remember, Olmsted's Park stopped at the railroad tracks. There was nothing beyond the tracks until Moses. To accomplish that, changes included filling in the park to the east of the train tunnel to raise the grades to the height of the new railroad roof, flattening sharp slopes, and removing and replacing many of the original stairways, paths, and plantings. Because of the Promethean changes made during the Moses era to accommodate tunnel and parkway, the interior of the park, for the most part, was no longer the vision of Olmsted or the work of the landscape architects that immediately followed him. Yet, for park goers, the most significant difference between Olmsted's Riverside Park and the one we know in the 21st century is where that 19th century plot of paradise ended, at the tracks. It is the master design of park and drive together for which Olmsted deserves the greatest recognition today. The sinuous drive adopted to the topography's shifting contours, the islands separating the main and ancillary roadways, and the retaining wall best represent Olmsted's lasting impact on Riverside Park and Riverside Drive when compared to developments in the Moses era. Along with expanding far beyond the tracks, the Moses Park focused on recreation while the original did not at all. The 1930s design created a profusion of playgrounds and sports facilities, including basketball, tennis, handball, and volleyball courts, ball fields, and more. Under Moses, it took just 3 years from 1934 to 1937 for the entire West Side Improvement Plan to be implemented. Can you imagine a project of that size happening with that speed today? In the process, landfill nearly doubled Riverside Park's size. There was a man-made promenade within the park for the first time, over the tracks enclosed by the tunnel. All of this, covered tracks, playgrounds and recreational facilities, additional park space, was in addition to the marina, rotunda, and of course, the completed West Side Highway and new Henry Hudson Parkway. When work was finished, one observer noted, Riverside Park was once again one of the most elegant parks in the city. And so, in my opinion, it remains today. There is more to the story of Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, of course. A few decades after Moses, the entire city declined and the park and drive with it. But then its neighbors took up arms, restored it, took care of it, and made it a warm and welcoming place to be once again. But all of that is a story for another evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. And at this point, I'm going to introduce another esteemed member of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, and that's Michael Gonzalez. Michael always coordinates a lot of the behind-the-scene details, and then especially any questions that people might have. So please feel free to click on your chat button or your Q&A button and just type in any questions that you might have. And Stephanie, I'm going to prompt you a little bit. If you and I had to brainstorm on what could we see in Riverside Park that goes back to its earliest days, and you already cited the Cyrus Clark bas-relief, that would be one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your book has like just so many tremendous photographs. Mount Tom is another one.
Yeah, that's the one I would really think of, actually. For those of you who may not know, there's this marvelous, huge outcropping around 83rd, 84th Street, known as Mount Tom. And actually, back in the day, this is where Edgar Allan Poe would go. He was staying at a farm nearby. He would go and look out at Riverside Drive and think. And it's at this time that he wrote The Raven. So I think that Riverside Drive and the Hudson River inspired his creativity from Mount Tom.
How about the elm trees? I have a couple of tree experts in our neighborhood that swear that a few very select trees go back to the earliest days of Riverside Park. What's your thoughts on that?
Now that is a question. My understanding is that the oldest trees in the park are uptown in where the wild bird sanctuary is. So we're talking about in the hundreds, and that those types of trees can last about 150 years. So there are still some there from the beginning of the park.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about the you kind of touch upon this, but the statuary in the park, Riverside Drive is a virtual museum of statuary. Is there any rhyme or reason to what's it? Oh, and I might point out, boy, it was a learning thing for me when you pointed out that the first statue of George Washington in the entire city was on the site of that Soldiers and Sailors Monument that's there today at 89th Street.
All of the monuments really started with the World Columbian Exposition in 1893. Columbian World Exposition. They presented the whole idea that it was important both to the morale and morals of people in city to be inspired by great aesthetics. And this translated into classic buildings, classic style buildings, and also into monuments. So monuments started appearing along Riverside Park. The first one was actually General Grant's mausoleum, General Grant's tomb. And several followed that in rapid succession in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So there are fabulous monuments there. There's a wonderful one to Joan of Arc. I personally love the Fireman's Monument at 100th Street. It's just beautiful, and it's where all the firefighters go on 9/11 to commemorate those who were lost. There are just beautiful monuments all up and down
You
Riverside.
you have that very uncommon photograph of the Columbus Monument where Eleanor Roosevelt is today. That's in your book as well.
Yes.
But we should trouble Michael. Michael, what questions do we have?
Sure. Let me start with a few questions here. Someone asked, with the New York and Hudson River Railroad being built in the 1850s, did any of these homes have easement or direct access to the shore of the Hudson?
That's an interesting question. So there is a building on 107th Street in Riverside Drive. It's called the Shinazi Mansion. It is an extraordinary building. It's been around from the early 1900s. And the story is that there was a tunnel that was under from the mansion to the river. And as strange as that may sound, the New York Times some years ago actually ran a photo of what they said was that tunnel. It is now sealed off, but boy, I wish I'd been there when that tunnel was there.
Okay, so the next question after that was, someone read at one point that the Seligman family owned the west side from Central Park West to Sputton Duville before the Civil War, and that the reluctance to sell any of the land they controlled to anyone for the personal homes or further development. The reluctance to sell led the wealthy to Fifth Avenue instead. Do you know if this is true or?
So it was a little bit difficult hearing you, Michael. So the question was, did the Seligman family own all of the land from 92nd Street, pretty much all the way up?
Right, and then was there reluctance to sell the land the reason that the people started going to Fifth Avenue to buy land, the wealthy people at least?
No, I would say no to that. The Seligman name is actually not one that I came across in doing research on the area. I suppose there may be someone I don't know about, but that is not my understanding.
Yeah, I can just add there's I forget which sculpture on the east side of Morningside Park, the one of Washington and Lafayette, or the nature one right inside the park. One of those was, I think, financed by J. Seligman from the Seligman family, who was a Columbia professor at the time, but nothing that connects to Riverside Drive that I'm aware of, like you, Stephanie.
Thank you. And then, can you give us more detail on the building of the railroad? Was there any opposition from the people who own homes or in that area?
They weren't thrilled. Well, actually, there wasn't much there. I'm correcting myself here. There wasn't much there at the time. Remember, these were just the summer houses. And while nobody appreciated having a railroad run through their front yard, which is what basically Riverside Park was at the time, they had no choice. This was a decision that was made, and the city was going ahead with it.
Got it. Thank you. We have a question from one of our members. Joan recalls reading that the Gershwin family lived just east of the 305 Riverside Drive. The neighborhood would be overcome by fumes from the rendering plants down in the park. Do you know if this is true?
Yes, the Gershwins did live on Riverside Park, both Gershwin brothers, and the fumes from the park when the tracks were still, before they were covered, were pretty bad. They were pretty bad. There was sewage. There was all the cattle, which would sometimes sit on the tracks in the park day after day. There were coal bins. For quite some time there, it was not a pleasant place to be in that respect. So I'm sure there were times when the fumes were more than overwhelming, especially in the summer.
Got it. An appreciation just from Vita saying that of her 25 years living on Riverside and without ever seeing the Rudden Noakes mansions, but the pictures blew her away.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
And then someone asked about the bowling alley on 120th Street. Was that really a thing?
It was. It was. I have confirmation from someone who actually bowled there way back. There was a bowling alley where Riverside Church is now.
Got it. Earlier, you mentioned that the lower hundreds were considered bankers' colony. Why do you think the hundreds were so popular among bankers?
It was the elevation. So the hundreds in Riverside Park are at a much higher elevation, much higher above sea level than the rest, most of the rest of Riverside Drive. So there were two advantages to that. One, you had the best view, the higher up you were, but also there was more distance between you and those trucks that we were just talking about. So you weren't inhaling those fumes we were just talking about. You weren't seeing the sewage, you weren't seeing the mess that was Riverside Park. And so around where the trains were. So if you could afford it, and these were bankers, and your other friends who were bankers were moving in, that's where you wanted to be.
Yeah, it was funny, Stephanie, you call that the happy hundreds.
Yes.
And then can you take credit for that stretch of gorgeous townhouses between 105th and 106th Street, where you call them the Seven Beauties? Are you the first person to do that?
I am not, no. No, I have to give that credit to another author. But that is an extraordinary block. I just adore that block. It is so, so beautiful, except for the one interruption of the of the Buddhist temple that doesn't go along with any of the other buildings there.
Well, thanks to Dan Waken and to you. And Dan said wonderful things about your book when it came out, but really bringing attention to that.
Yes.
Michael, we have some more?
Yes. I think one of our viewers noticed that Riverside Drive was named Lafayette at some point. Is that true?
Not to my knowledge. I do not believe so.
Okay, got it.
Oh, there was some, sorry. I'm hearing Park, you said Drive. Yes, there was part of Riverside Drive up Northmore that was named Lafayette for a while before it became part of the drive itself. This was once the drive extended farther uptown.
Okay, thank you. And one of our questions from a resident, I'm assuming, is, do you know when the wonderful M5 bus route began?
No, I do not, but I love that bus. I love getting on that bus and just looking out the window as I go by at the mansions and at Riverside Park. It is my favorite bus in the whole city.
Well, I think I may be off by a year or two, but I know they had a 100th birthday celebration around 2012, I believe.
Wow.
But I think I'm off by a year or two.
Fantastic.
One of your photographs had the double-decker buses on Riverside Drive.
Yes, yeah. It was, I loved when we were going through the photographs to choose them for the book. I just love seeing these old vehicles.
Speaking of mansions, do you know if any remain on the Riverside Drive?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. There are actually two fabulous old villas. Not talking townhouses here, not talking row houses, though many of those exist. But there are two absolutely amazing villas, one on 89th Street and one on 107th Street. And the one on 107th Street, that's the one with the tunnel. It is the only privately owned freestanding villa remaining on Riverside Drive. And the second one is now a yeshiva, a school.
Oh. All right. And did Riverside Drive ever become the new Fifth Avenue as intended? And if not, why?
No, it did not. It did not. And the reasons were that basically the residents of Fifth Avenue, the very, very wealthy residents of Fifth Avenue, already had everything they needed. There was no reason for them to head across town and uptown to Riverside Drive. The wives could visit other wives and leave their cards and do their shopping in the area. The men could gather together at the clubs that were already on the Upper East Side. And as far as the wonderful view of the river that Riverside uniquely offered, they had Newport, they had other mansions on other waters. So they simply didn't need it. And they wanted to stay with their own kind, the other rich people.
Got it. And I mean, personal question for myself. Well, I mean, what was your favorite part to research throughout Riverside Drive?
You know, there were many things involved in this research, going through a lot of newspaper archives, which I absolutely loved. I had never read 1880s New York Times before, and that was fabulous. So that was one of my favorite things. The other favorite thing was walking up and down Riverside Drive, which I did constantly, and I still do constantly because I love it. Walking up and down the drive, staring at the buildings and talking to everyone I could find, talking to the doorman, talking to the supers, talking to the handyman, leaving notes for the presidents of the various boards to get more information. So those two things were my favorite.
Got it. Thank you.
I have a personal question too, Stephanie. Many of the photographs, which are historic, are, I mean, extraordinary, your choice, but many of the current photographs are equally fabulous, and they give perspectives that just add to the full richness of all that you're writing about. And I noticed the name of the photographer was Robert Rodriguez. How did you come to even find this guy?
Well, thank you so much for asking that, Jim. Robert Rodriguez is my husband and took these wonderful, wonderful contemporary photographs for the book, for which I am eternally grateful.
Amen. Amen. Well, we're eternally grateful for what you've done here, not just the presentation, but the book. We can't say enough wonderful things about it. It's inspiring, and thank you so much for this evening's presentation. And if anybody has any questions, by all means, just email to our upperwestsidehistory.org website and go there. I think you'll find it quite enjoyable. And through Michael's always made arrangements for these presentations to go on to YouTube. So Michael, maybe you could tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah, so all of our presentations that we've made since 2020 and a few of the other historical presentations that we've had are available on our YouTube. And you can find the links to our recent presentation on the upperwestsidehistory.org website. And yeah, it'll be there probably tomorrow morning. And you can find through there the channel that we post them all, which is the Columbus Amsterdam Business Improvement District channel. But yeah, just find the link tomorrow and you'll be able to find the rest of the videos is there too.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Stephanie, so much. This is wonderful history in the making. Thanks to you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening.
Yep.
All right, thank
you. Good
you.
night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.